Welcome everyone to a new special emergency episode of the Can't Stand podcast. I had not promised but announced that I would have been absent from uploading anything substantial on the Can't Stand YouTube channel and social media. But as you can see, I'm back and I brought some company with me. I'm happy to announce that the first guest ever on the Can't Stand podcast, and it's really been about time, is a good friend of mine who has dived very deep into lots of topics that are tangible for us, for those who are interested mostly in Turkic, but also in other parts of steppe history. And his name is CopperAxe. He is also best known for a blog, Musaeum Scythia, which has recently been converted into a Substack page. So it's not just me having a Substack page recently, but also CopperAxe, who has released some tremendous articles about some steppe history that precedes most of the stuff that I talk most of the time. And he's especially interested in Hunnic, early Hunnic, so Han in Europe, and also Xiongnu history. So with that being said, welcome CopperAxe. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you. It's a blessing to be here. Great introduction. Thank you. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, right? So let's announce what we're going to be talking about. Just dive right into it.
Yeah. And you know what they say, it's always better the second time. So
Yeah.
this is actually the second recording that we are doing, but for a different app because we had this conversation some time ago, and for some reason, because I didn't click on some options, it was only my voice being recorded and not that of CopperX. So I would have seemed kind of schizophrenic, basically. And that's why we thought that we should maybe just conduct the same conversation again. Nothing really has changed, but we have even more fun this time around, even more energy. We are even more euphoric because this CopperAxe is an interesting topic, but it might be a bit complex judging just from the abstract of this article that we are going to talk about. So maybe you can summarize just quickly what kind of article we are going to talk about. It's obviously something, regarding Hunnic, Han history, but what exactly are we looking at here right now?
Right. Hopefully, no, we don't need a third time's the charm, right? Yeah, the article that we are, and really, I would say more so the topic that we're going to be talking about is, I think it's something that quite a lot of your fans would have come across, but like a few months ago, June, right? There was an article titled "The Linguistic Evidence Suggests that Xiongnu and Huns Spoke the Same Paleo-Siberian Language" by Svenja Bonmann and Simon Fries, or Simon Fries. That's I'm not sure on the pronunciation. And basically, in this article, they essentially make the argument that the Xiongnu, or perhaps in some other instances, they make the argument that perhaps only a section or an element, the elites or whatever, right, that they were Yeniseian speakers. They provide their case, right, from a linguistic argument that the Xiongnu were Yeniseian. Also, right, that the European Huns arriving in Europe and having, this sort of like short-lived but very interesting and also important, right, period in European history, that they too were Yeniseian, right?
Mhm.
And obviously the theory regarding the Yeniseian origins of the Xiongnu is not entirely new. However, the assertiveness with which they declare this and also extrapolate this to the European Huns is certainly bold, to say the least. I'll just read the abstract quickly, right?
Yeah.
The Xiongnu were a tribal confederation who dominated Inner Asia from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD. Xiongnu descendants later constituted the ethnic core of the European Huns. It has been argued that the Xiongnu spoke an Iranian, Turkic, Mongolic, or Yeniseian language, but the linguistic affiliation of the Xiongnu and the Huns is still debated. Here, we show that linguistic evidence from 4 independent domains does indeed suggest that the Xiongnu and the Huns spoke the same Paleo-Siberian language, and that this was an early form of Aryan, a member of the Yeniseian language family. This identification augments and confirms genetic and archaeological studies and inspires new interdisciplinary research on Eurasian population history. Now, cool, interesting, right? I think probably your, stances on this are like, quite clear, perhaps, but maybe you should, yeah, give your opinion. What you think of the article and the conclusions, and then I'll give my view on it, right? I'll give your fans a little preview. I heavily disagree with the conclusions the authors made, both from a linguistic, but also more importantly, I would say an archaeological and a genetic perspective. But I'll get into that in a bit. You go
Yeah,
ahead first.
sure. I suppose that my stance is clear for everyone listening right now. You guys all know how I feel about the discussion, this actually century-old discussion about whether the Xiongnu, first of all, really would have been related more closely to the Huns, who later arrived in Europe or in Central Asia, Western Central Asia. And the second discussion about whether the Xiongnu should be classified as a mostly Turkic people or Turkic at least at its core, meaning regarding the political elite, the people who actually, created, founded, and administered this empire or this confederation. And I am of the strong opinion, and it hasn't really changed over the years. I would even more so say that I feel actually more confident saying this right now than I would have maybe 5 years ago. I would argue that the Xiongnu, if anything, if we are being so courageous as to classifying them as either of these, linguistic cultural groups that only later got their names, would have definitely been Turkic and more Turkic than anything else, which is not saying that there wouldn't have been any non-Turkic influences, because it was a multicultural steppe state, a polity that ruled over a variety of peoples, including, for example, Mongolic peoples, more so to the east, or Iranic peoples, more so to the west. But the thing that I don't get about this article is that the Turkic peoples, they're being mentioned, but as you kind of implied, they are being negated more or less. If you press on Control F on your computer on the website and you search for the term Turkic or Turk, you're going to find that very often in the article. But what they're doing most of the time, or actually all of the time, is that they're negating Turkic cultural groups to have had any connection to the Xiongnu at all. Once the Turkic people are out of the way, they're trying to construct a new theory which is interesting and, as you said, is quite bold. But the Yeniseian people, the original, not the Kyrgyz, Yenisei Kyrgyz, but the original Yeniseian people, are so far off from anything that at the time of the Xiongnu and even before and especially later on, so far distant from anything, any of the dynamics taking place. And I'm, of course, talking about cultural, but especially political events. So there's, I wouldn't say evidence, but some very clear implications that the core of the Xiongnu were at least influenced by, Turkic culture traits. I am also a firm believer that the Xiongnu at their core were indeed followers of Tengri, of the sky deity or sky god, maybe in a more polytheistic way than the Gökturks some 8, 9 centuries later. And the names of Xiongnu rulers, especially of a certain Bagatur, despite perhaps originally not the prefix being of Turkic origin, but being used, well, only by Turkic peoples in the steppe, a lot of these small details indicate that yes, the Xiongnu were Turkic rulers, but not the same Turkic people you would encounter, I don't know, among the old Bulgars some 8 centuries later, or among the Kipchaks and so on. Because Turkic was an identity, Old Turkic also, that was defined by language and some cultural traits. Maybe less so by DNA, I suppose, but you're more an expert on that regard. And so I skimmed through the article the first time around, and I said to myself, well, it isn't really bad, but they're conducting some really grave mistakes and they're jumping over a lot of dynamics and processes. And I would also say that the worst part of this article isn't even about the Xiongnu, but about the Huns and Attila, because obviously, if you establish that, or once you have established that the Xiongnu would have been Yeniseian people, then you make the connection between the Xiongnu and the Huns of Attila in Europe. And of course, you're gonna, come to the conclusion that the Huns in Europe had also been Yeniseian, which is crazy. But that's
Yeah,
just my
well,
humble opinion. What do you think about
yeah.
it?
Well, I mean, there's also you've had other proposals, right? So the theory regarding the Xiongnu having potentially spoken in Yeniseian is quite old. It's from like the early 20th century, I think maybe like in the 20s or the 30s was the first proposal. But it gained prominence because of linguists such as like I think it's Edward, but it might be wrong, Polyblank, who, when looking at words in the Chinese language, which seem to come from the Xiongnu, and also in
Yeah.
particular looking at a couplet from a people connected to the southern Xiongnu called the Jie, right? A war cry, where basically it's like a Tocharian monk, Fotu Deng, recorded this war cry of the Jie people, essentially saying, like our armies have gone out, we'll catch the commander or something. And he transliterate. So he wrote down the corresponding Chinese characters to sort of replicate the sound, right? Problem
Mm.
is that this was in early Middle Chinese, and modern the pronunciation of modern Chinese has shifted quite a bit over the centuries,
Mm.
right? While the characters
Yeah.
have stayed sort of largely the same. So in order to really figure out how to pronounce this, you know what I mean? You have to take several leaps of faith, right?
Yeah.
And Edward Pullyblank, being a sinologist, having a pretty good understanding of this, pointed out that there are quite a few words that just do not really make a lot of sense from if you want to argue that these are sort of native Turkic words, which doesn't mean that he is saying that the Xiongnu didn't speak Turkic or etc. But what he pointed out was that some of these words do not make sense as
Mm.
far as like being of Turkic origin. And for some of these, I would very happily agree with him that they don't make sense being of Turkic origin, right? However, right, his solution to the problem, right, what are the origins of this language is then Yeniseian, right? And this was then by linguists such as like Alexander Vovin, this was developed even further. And historians caught wind of this theory and then started playing with, the possibilities that perhaps the Xiongnu as an empire, right, and the people and foundation far in the east, that they were Yeniseian speakers, but
Mm.
then arriving in Europe, there would have been a linguistic shift, right? I think this is what also mentioned Halfin perhaps argues, but I might not be correct there. I know it's Kim in his book on the Huns argues, this schematic. So it is not necessarily new, right, to sort of like argue this Yeniseian origin for the Xiongnu. But even when it comes to European Huns, typically, right, what is pointed towards is that they were Turkic people. So perhaps arguing that the Huns in Europe, right, being in Hungary and fighting all these battles and all over, entering the Western Roman Empire, that these were only like Yeniseian speaking people. That is a new theory, right? So basically, in the article, they take this, already sort of like older theory of Xiongnu words of Yeniseian origin, right? Which they then add to the J couplet, right? Yeah, I think that's quite weak evidence, right? Because first of all, are these identifications of Yeniseian etymologies correct, right? Because basically what you do is you reconstruct how a word would have been pronounced roughly, right?
Mm.
And then you just shop around in various languages, right? And then you find words, phrases, etc., that, have like a like a phonological match. And then you kind of just sort of have to wiggle, you know what I mean? Sort of your way through, be like, yeah, well, I mean, if this is pronounced that way, then that could actually perfectly be a Yeniseian loanword, right? And then, you have to give some sort of like sensible etymological like explanation. But the problem is that like different researchers have different interpretations of this, right? Like I don't have any examples at hand because basically I came unprepared in a sense. Yeah, that I don't have my notes or anything with me. But I've seen quite a few cases where words that Vovin or Pulley Blank or etc. argue to have been of Yeniseian extraction. Other linguists like Anna Debo uh, would argue are of Iranian origin, right? And the second point that they then make is then they identify a hydronym, which is really prevalent in Turkic-speaking regions or former Turkic-speaking regions, right? Which is like the cool hydronym, right? Think of Lake Issyk, right? Issyk-Kul,
Mm.
right? Or I don't know, you have like Karakol and the Altai, right? Black Lake and etc., right? And they argue that this would have been of Yeniseian origin, right? That this Turkic hydronym would have been of Yeniseian origin, showcasing that there was this ancient, wide, distribution of Yeniseian speaking people in this nomadic sort of territory, right? And yeah, like I said, I have a difficult time accepting this because none of it is based on like anything that you can certify, right? There's no guarantee that any of these, I guess like what's the best thing to call them, reconstructions, right, are legitimate, right? That they're valid. We do not have Xiongnu manuscripts where we can like very easily read what they wrote, and we don't have there's very little linguistic information to work with, right? And
Yeah.
like I said earlier, you can kind of really fit it into whatever linguistic scenario that you want, right? And when it comes to the European hunts, they basically provide no real evidence from a linguistic point of view. They actually refer to the genetic evidence recently that has shown this true genetic connection between the nomads of the Xiongnu Empire and the nomads that are European Huns, right? Fortunately, we don't have the DNA data from any of the regions where the Central Asian Huns would have been situated, so I think it would best to leave them as an aside for now, right? But the European Huns and the Xiongnu of Central Mongolia have a very strong genetic connection. And this they then use to argue that the European Huns were also Yeniseian speaking people, which I think is a fallacy, right? I'll give an explanation based on
Sure.
archaeology and DNA why
Yeah.
um, this is wrong. But I guess maybe at first you should give like a short summary of who like the Yeniseian people were, and perhaps is why linguists are so like, yeah, I don't know, fascinated with them, right? So Yeniseian is a language that's at the point of extinction, right? There's only one Yeniseian ethnic group alive, Ket. I think it's a few thousand people, and most of them have very mixed ancestry as well. There's only a handful of speakers, a couple dozen. They're all middle-aged, they're all old. It's like likely within our lifetime, Yeniseian is going to go extinct, right? So it is a language spoken by a very, very small community on the middle Yenisei River. Historically, the Yeniseian community was larger. So when the Russians were going through Siberia in their time of their colonial conquest, they came across these people on the Yenisei River, and the people in the south, interestingly, were called Tatars because they lived in tents. They had livestock, right, and they had horses, and they lived in a way very similar to the various Turkic people surrounding them, which were, like you mentioned earlier, the Yenisei Kyrgyz, right? Now they're known as like the Khakas and the Shor and all these sort of
Hmm.
various people in these regions, but around those time they were still called the Kyrgyz, right? And this was a population that was already significantly undergoing Turkification, right? So that meant that you had a lot of Turkish-speaking people in that area that some centuries prior would have been speaking Yeniseian or would have been speaking Samoyedic, but now we're speaking Turkic, right? So even when the Russians arrived, this was a small dwindling population, and the Aryans people, they were one of them. If you go further to the north, this no nomadic influenced sort of lifestyle stops existing, right? You start looking at sedentary fishermen, hunter-gatherers, etc. And the Russians called them Ostyaks. And it wasn't even until I think some decades after that they realized that these Ostyaks to the north and the Tatars to the south, that they spoke the same language, right? That they were
Hmm.
linguistically related, and that they were the Yeniseian people. And this is a region that does slightly overlap with the Xiongnu sort of territory, right? But it's very marginal. If you look at the density of Yeniseian toponyms and where most people place sort of the Proto-Yeniseian homeland, and when I say most people, it is really a handful of people because it's only a handful of researchers that deal with this
Hmm.
topic, right? And basically, they place them between the rivers of the Yenisei and the western shores of Lake Baikal. And these are definitely regions that were on the fringe of the Xiongnu Empire. We know this, right? We know that the Chinese and the Xiongnu they had battles, near Lake Baikal in the second century BC. So that this region, sort of where you would have had the core Yeniseian territory, that overlaps with to some degree with the Xiongnu territory. Yeah, right. There is a sort of like in that sense, there is somewhat of a geographical match. The only problem is we have no idea when this geographical match actually existed, right? The fact that it existed in the Middle Ages, in the early Common Era, right, does not mean we can extrapolate this with certainty to thousands of years before, right? So
Mm.
yeah, you have Yeniseian toponyms in northern Mongolia, right? But we do not know when those toponyms existed there, right? For all you know, Proto-Yeniseian speakers, which roughly would have lived around 2,000 years ago, moved slightly southwards and entered in northern Mongolia after the Xiongnu Empire. These are all things you can't know, you can't take all these type of points for granted, right? But yeah, in any case, right? The Yeniseian people and then were on the periphery of the nomadic world, and their languages reflect this because the Yeniseian languages, the Southern Yeniseian language in particular, are filled with Turkic loanwords. And if you look at Turkic languages, there is very few, if any, like real Yeniseian loanwords, right? Leaving aside these hypothetical, reconstructed sort of, potential Yeniseian loanwords in Turkic, right?
Mm.
As in words that really truly come from the Yeniseian people, right? Going into the Turkic languages, especially at an early phase, it doesn't really seem to be there. And it's very logical why. The Yeniseian people were a small Siberian ethnic group on a fringe of this larger nomadic world, right? And it's obviously steppe nomads, right, are going to have a higher population density than sort of fringe hunter-gatherers, to the north, right? Are going to be more technologically advanced. They have far more contact with the wider world, right? So in every sense, right? Because especially since you talked about the political sense, right? The power is going to be in the world of the steppe nomads, right? And this is why what we can also see from genetics, right? If you look at the genetics of various Turkic and Mongolic, nomadic people in that northern sort of periphery, right, of like South Siberia, Mongolia, and etc., what you can often see is that quite a few of their lineages will come from these sort of more northern peripheral people that get assimilated into the, larger nomadic population. And I can really only think of two cases where a northern population like this adopted the steppe nomad culture, but didn't lose their language. And there's really only two cases. This shows you this is very rare:
Mm.
the Southern Yeniseian people and the Hungarians, right? And these are the only people, right, on the steppes that we have evidence of that are a northern peripheral people that move to the south, retain their language, and adopt a nomadic steppe culture, right? And if you want to take the Hungarians as an example, right, these are people with hundreds of loanwords from Iranians and many loanwords from Turkic people, right? They share gods, they share writing, right? They share all sorts of nomadic terminology with Turkic people, and even claimed Attila the Hun as like as their mythological ancestor, and etc. Right? So,
Bro.
um, like this shows you the power dynamic between sort of these northern peripheral people and the people on the steppes, right? Just sort of briefly summarized. Now, this is where it really gets problematic when it comes to the Xiongnu, right? Because, like I said, right, you have a potential chance that the Yeniseian speaking people live to the northwest of the Xiongnu Empire. So the Xiongnu Empire was started when Modu Chanyu, or the Bahadur, right? When he ordered the death of his father, and then he started conquering all these various nomadic people, right? To his west, to the east, and most importantly to the north. And we know that in 176 BC, Modu Chanyu basically sent like a letter to the Han Dynasty emperor, bragging that he had conquered people from as far west as Xinjiang to the Altai to Lake Baikal to the border of Manchuria, bragging that all these people now are under his dominion. All the people of the bow are united as one. They've all become
Mm.
Han. That's what he said in this letter, right? But that tells you something, right? But this northern region, that isn't where the Xiongnu are from, right? The Xiongnu as a confederation are tested first, I think, in the 4th century BC, or certainly in the 3rd century BC, and they were tested on the other side of the Yellow River. So they were tested in northern China, and they only moved northwards after this stage, right? So in order to explain the Xiongnu elite, right? Because these early Xiongnu north of the Yellow River, those are the ones that become the elite, right? The Luandi clan and etc. Right? You would then have to explain why the people in that region originate from this northwestern periphery. So their ancestors would have migrated thousands of kilometers to the south, right? And I know what some of your people are going to be thinking, oh, well, they're nomads. Steppe nomads just move around, right? But this is wrong. Yeah, steppe nomads move around, right? Nomadism, right? It's like that's what it means. However, it's not randomly going from one place to another. You don't live in the Lake Issyk-Kul one year and then you live in Hungary the next year and then you move to I don't know Turkmenistan the next year, right? That's not
Hmm.
how it works. Like steppe nomads, they their movement, whether it is transhuman, so you only move between two certain spots, or it is random movement where you just move around every once in a while. It's a very calculated effort, right? It also is typically sort of centered around a particular biome, right? If you were to put a Yakut in Turkmenistan and tell him, hey, good luck, survive, right? It's a pretty good chance you won't.
Hmm.
Because
True.
it's like you go from the depths of Siberia into a desert. You've no like you're sure you can be a nomad in one area, you could be a nomad in another area. You won't know how to survive, right? Because you have to sort of kind of like stick to your biome. That's at the very least sort of like how nomads move, right? So to move from an area north of the Sayan Mountains requires you to not only cross mountains, but then also go from from like a colder, perhaps in the summertime is more lush because it's a mountainous area, it's a lot of rivers, so you're gonna have grass in the warm months and terrible colds in the winter months, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to go to the Mongolian grasslands. You have to go to the Gobi Desert. You have to cross that entire desert. Then you have to sort of be on the inner Mongolian plains south of that desert to then interact with all these Chinese, sort of like, these virgin, the ancient Chinese civilization, and then conquer northwards, right? This is if you really think about it, right? It's a theoretically possible but very unlikely like migration route that if would have happened really should have been the result of a very gradual sort of migration over many centuries even. The reality is there's just simply no evidence of this. We have no evidence of steppe nomads in that sort of northwestern fringe, right? Moving to northern China at like any time in the first millennium sort of BC. From like an archaeological perspective, there really isn't
Hmm.
anything that showcases this. Obviously, I know quite a bit about the archaeology of the steppe region, and obviously in the Iron Age, you have like the Scythian cultures around the Altai, Western Mongolia, and then in the central Mongolia, in the early Iron Age, you have the slab grave culture, and then if you go and into the east, you have like the Upper Sheshaden and various other sort of like smaller material cultures around like Manchuria. If you take this zone and you move further south to the northern Chinese periphery, right?
Hmm.
You see a reflection of this larger steppes in terms of the material culture, whereas the regions in the west seem very much going towards Xinjiang and etc. are very much connected to the Scythian world, and the region to the east of that in the early Iron Age is actually very much connected to the slab grave, right? And this is reflected in the third century BC as well, because um, you have three nomadic political factions, right? You have the Yuetia, right, which were from Eastern Xinjiang and Western Gansu. Then you have the Xiongnu that would have been sort of situated in for the most part Inner Mongolia and bits of these other Chinese provinces. And to the east
Hmm.
are the Donghu. These sort of nomadic polities that you would have had are kind of a reflection of the biological sort of like populations to the north of them. To make the claim that the people in between the Donghu, which were certainly Mongolic speaking, and the people east of the Yuetia, which either were Iranian or Tocharian speaking, we don't really know too well. I would put my bets on Iranian, but I cannot give you any real evidence for this, right? To then sort of argue that the people in the midst are Yeniseian speaking in my opinion, would require some very good strong evidence. And like I said, from archaeology, there's really nothing that points toward this, right? Like even the Xiongnu material culture seems to be an amalgamation of the best way to describe it is just sort of slab grave like material culture because I don't think that the Xiongnu are direct descendants of the early Iron Age slab grave people of Central Mongolia. Maybe explain that in a bit. And
Hmm.
also the various sort of like Iranian Scythian culture that had an influence on them, right? Which is noticeable in their metallurgy and various other stuff. But also the Han Chinese material influence is quite strong on the Xiongnu, and even at like an early stage, there's quite an influence of this. Yeah, to argue from an archaeological perspective, because it did mention that archaeology supports this, which like it doesn't, right? To that then this population was Yeniseian just really doesn't work, right? Before I perhaps dive into why this also doesn't work from a genetic point of view, do you have any questions or any remarks you want to make?
All right. So you just mentioned in the discussion the Jie people who used to reside and rule in northern China, I think in like the fourth century. Maybe you
Yeah.
can give us a quick summary about, again, who the Jie people are and dive into the discussion of genetics of the Jie people. And maybe we will find something interesting, an interesting connection, perhaps, regarding
Yeah.
the Yeniseian people.
Well, I'm gonna have to disappoint you there. We have 0.0 genetic evidence related to the J people. I guess perhaps the closest thing is that you have I came across an individual modern Chinese tester with the last name Shi, meaning stone, right? This is different from
Yeah.
Shi, meaning historian. And that was the last name of the ruling dynasty of the later Zhao dynasty, which were Yeniseians, or were Yeniseians, were Jie, right? So who are the Jie people? So according to the Chinese like historical sources, which is the only information we have on the Jie people, is that they were members of the Xiongnu, right? They were part of the Southern Xiongnu, which were the Xiongnu groups that accepted Chinese hegemony and then lived in northern China. And then when China had their empire collapse, you had all these various sort of barbarian ruled rump states, very similar to what happened in Europe with the
Hmm.
collapse of the Roman Empire and all these various Germanic tribes ruling all these areas. And the Jie were one of these people that for a while, ruled parts of China, right? We obviously know from a history that the big winners were the Shanbei, right? The Toba, which then obviously had the Northern Wei dynasty, which was like a really, large Chinese dynastic empire ruled by the Shanbei, right? Which were the descendants of the Donghu, Mongolic steppe people. So the Jie are relatively sort of poorly attested, right? And had perhaps an humble a humble rise, I would say, right? Because you had a man called Shi. He was at some point he was a slave, the Shanbei or some other group. Obviously he got his freedom, and then in sort of the politics of the later Zhao dynasty, he would have been under the rule of a Xiongnu-led sort of polity in China. Yeah, worked himself into power and became a ruler. And then for at least some generations, the later Zhao dynasty, right? They were being ran by these like Jie people. I think the third ruler, which I think was like a cousin of like his son or something. I'm going off the top of memory here. That guy was insane, like legitimately just crazy, and
Hmm.
just killed a lot of people, and then etc. And then there was an uprising against the Jie people, which the Chinese were able to point out very easily because the Jie people looked very. They call them Hu, right? Barbarian facial features,
Hmm.
but in a common sense, it's like quite Western, right? But don't make the mistake of assuming this means that they look like West Asian people or European people or something, right? It's just that from the point of view of people that are, physically entirely Asian, right? Some of these features stood out, which were deep set eyes, big noses, bushy beards, and
Hmm.
basically they had this massive uprising and were able to point out everybody that looked like a J, right? Or everybody that was a J, supposedly, and
Hmm.
killed them. And everybody that had big beards and big noses and deep set eyes, they were all massacred. Hundreds and thousands of people died. And that is the end of the Jie people. Now, if you were a
Wow.
Chinese individual with a Sogdian grandparents, right, it's a pretty good chance you got killed as well, because obviously you're gonna look like one, right? And it's a very interesting story of the Jie people, and that which the Chinese, according to their history, the Jie people were part of the Xiongnu Empire. Very interesting story, right? But them being Yeniseian is, I think it's difficult to sell. There's various theories. Some people suppose that because Shi stone was also used by migrants that came from Sogdia, that perhaps the Jie were actually some Central Asian Iranic people that had moved
Mm.
into this, northern Chinese sphere, just like the Sogdians would in the Middle Ages. There's also been various other proposals that the Jie were just some Turkic people. And
Mm-hmm.
there's been linguistic interpretations that this J language was actually one of the earliest forms of attested Turkic. Now, I think this is the reasonable is it's a reasonable theory, right? The problem is that, as far as I know, is that the only linguistic efforts done were quite poor from like linguistic standards. You really had to sort of like splice together all these various different Turkic dialects and whatever to make this one sentence, this battle cry of the Jie people, to turn that into Turkic. There's also perhaps the argument that a Tocharian monk named Fotu Dung from that period would have been familiar with Turkey, considering the Tocharians at some point in time were under Xiongnu hegemony and also would have been in
Mm-hmm.
contact with
Mm-hmm.
various other, Turkic peoples. However, you can make the same case for the Iranian argument, right? Because Tocharians also would have been quite close to various Iranian-speaking people of the Tarim Basin and the Chechen Mountains, etc., right? But in any case, this one phrase is, yeah, it's basically you can like you cannot prove like a linguistic, you know what I mean? You cannot prove sort of like with a linguistic certainty that oh, the J people they spoke this language based off this one transliteration of their battle cry because we do not know for certain what that battle cry sounded like
Mm.
in their time period. Now the thing is that funnily enough, this individual that had the last name Stone, right? Well, I mean, there's many people in China that have the last name, Shi, meaning stone, is very common,
Mm.
right? However, he had a haplogroup called R1a YP5505. And for the genetic aficionados amongst your fan bases, perhaps they would be aware that haplogroup YP5505 is a haplogroup quite commonly found amongst the European Huns. And also, it's a haplogroup that is very clearly of Xiongnu origin and in deeper origins would have come from Scythian groups that would have been living around the Altai and Tuva, those regions that then got assimilated into the Xiongnu Hunnic community, right?
Yeah.
That isn't to
Yeah.
say that that individual descends from Shule or his descendants or any other J people. I cannot know that. I don't think anybody can know that. However, it is funny that that genetic connection exists, right? Between that last name, perhaps J, right? And like a core lineage of the European Huns. So perfect moment to segue into the topic of genetics. When we look at the genetic samples that we have from the Xiongnu Empire and the European Huns, you have to be careful because it's massively diverse, right? And it's massively diverse for two different reasons, right? Although they're actually quite similar. The samples of the Xiongnu period are diverse because the Xiongnu was this massive empire that not only hosted a large population, but also would have been bringing in foreigners, right? So there is a large sample set of what I think you could just best describe as sort of like Asiatic steppe nomads, right? In a sense that they have a lot of sort of like Northeast Asian ancestry. Then you have a relatively large batch of samples that are a lot more Western, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of these really sort of deviate more towards these like earlier Scythian individuals, right? That would have been living in the Altai region and in Tuva. Other samples deviate towards the contemporary, the populations of Xinjiang around that time period. And we even get migrants from Western Central Asia, right, amongst the Xiongnu samples. We also have individuals that are very clearly of more Eastern origin, right, being
Mm-hmm.
very likely Donghu, or at this time perhaps better described as Wuhan or Shanbei individuals within the sample sets of the Xiongnu. We even have individuals that are entirely Han Chinese, actually, quite some of them, because of this one. like burial grave where a whole bunch of sort of like Han soldiers were buried, but also a lot of people that are mixed, right? They'll have we have several samples that have basically 50% Chinese ancestry, right? So they're a mix of a nomad and Chinese individual. We have individuals that are a mix of Western nomads and Eastern nomads. So, you know, you
Hmm.
get, yeah, you essentially you get a whole bunch of mixed race people, right? A lot of them. That creates quite a sort of genomic diversity, right? Likewise, what we see in the European Huns, the samples related to their period, obviously some of them are real European Huns. However, some of them are Alans, some of them are Goths, some of them are Dacians, some of them are
Hmm. Hmm.
Romans, and some of them are people mixed between all these various people, right? And even more Celtic ancestry, Balto-Slavic ancestry, right? Because they're at the crossroads of many different yeah groups and societies, right? So when it comes to the Xiongnu, from a genetic point of view, you can essentially establish this. There's a main population that undoubtedly represents the demographic majority of the Xiongnu Empire. These are Northeast Asian peoples, right? That sometimes are mixed with these other peoples, like I described earlier, right? But this is the
Hmm.
core. This is the majority of the population you're going to find within the Xiongnu Empire, right? I would make the case that those individuals are Turkic speakers. Now, why would I make that case? It's because they have a very, very strong genetic connections to various Turkic peoples. What we can see is that during this, you know, like imperial period, right, this Northeast Asian population then kind of like absorbs these various other groups, but then always remains sort of the majority. So it's the other groups assimilating into their population, not the other way around, right?
Hmm.
When centuries later, right, we find the samples of the European Huns, we can very clearly demonstrate that they descend from this nomadic core in the East, right? They have the same type of autosomal ancestry. The samples of the European Huns are basically, for the majority, derived from the same Northeast Asian population. However, with some ancestry from um, the more Western people in the Xiongnu Empire, so people from, let's say, the Altai and Tuva, right? The earlier Scythian type people, but as well as people from Xinjiang, etc., right? So they have a minority of this ancestry, but most of their ancestry comes from yeah, this Northeast Asian population. And this is the genetic connections that the authors alluded to that DNA has shown, right? This core Xiongnu population moves from Mongolia into Eastern Europe, right? And that genetic transplant is what they then argue is then why the why the European Huns spoke Yeniseian, right? So
Yeah.
what is it exactly about the genetics that makes me say, okay, yeah, there's really no chance that there's like any Yeniseian speaking being spoken here? Well, it's because it always is difficult connecting language to genetics, right? And it's very easy to say, well, language can flow without any gene flow, and gene flow can flow without any languages. And yeah, well, yeah, sure, this is true, right? It mostly this only really happens in like literate urban societies, right? If you talk about like um tribal yeah population, even the ones in empires, right, like in the Xiongnu Empire, it still essentially is a pyramid, right, of like basically tribes, right? And then as you move up the pyramid becomes smaller, and then at the top of the pyramid you have like, you know what I mean, the ultimate leader. But it is still at its core it is like, you know, like a tribal, yeah, type society. And most of the people would have been illiterate, you know, they would have not been reading, right? You know, they just would have been living their lives as like you know, like shepherds, right? And in such a setting, there really isn't a lot of evidence for linguistic changes without gene flow. Well, you know, honestly, I dare anybody to point to one example because in the Eurasian steppes there is none of this, right? When there is a linguistic change from Iranic to Turkic, there's a very clear genetic change, right? When Hungarian speakers show up, there is a very clear genetic change that points towards, you know what I mean, the Uralic affinities of the Hungarian language. When the
Mm.
Mongolian people spread, there is a very clear genetic shift that, separates them from Turkic. And I can go on and I can go on and on and on. Basically, if you deal with this level of social dynamics, this level of sort of, like technology, etc., there definitely is going to be a relation between genetics and language, not in the sense that your genes dictate what language you speak, but that the path that your ancestors took is going to be reflected in your genetics. And that is also what is going to direct, you know what I mean, your language, right? And the Yeniseian people are a very unique population genetically. Now, I will preface that their uniqueness is a bit overstated. They're often described as these relics from, paleo, sort of like paleo American population or something. This isn't really true in the sense that, yeah, there's some kind of like very distant relationship, but basically, the Yeniseian people are a descendants of the Bronze Age inhabitants of the exact same region that I was talking about earlier.
Mm.
So from the Yenisei region to the Baikal Lake, and then also bits of northwestern Mongolia and etc. Right? Now, an interesting thing is that if this region, right, Western Mongolia, if you talk about, so let's say 4,000 years ago, you will actually find populations there that are very closely related to the modern Yeniseian speaking people. Well, I said 2,000, 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC. That is perhaps around the time that they only began diverging genetically, right? So you do have a population that is related to later Yeniseian speaking people, right? That lived in those areas. And they would have been living there for quite a long time. However, as we know in the steppes, population is going to change a bit. And what happened was is that um, people from the West arrived, right, of the Andronovo culture, um, which is a material culture that has been associated with Indo-Iranian languages, and that like genetics is very strongly,
Mm.
supported that claim. They start arriving in regions such as the Altai and the Ministans Basin, etc., and they start mixing with this population. And this mixing event is actually what is the ethnogenesis of the nomadic people of the Iron Age, right? This sort of people call them like Scythians, but we have no idea what they call themselves that far in the east. But in the early Iron Age, this mixture occurred there, and that led to the honestly the start of like the steppe nomad culture as we know it. However, at the same time, there were people from the east that were from the southeast, from Inner Mongolia, that migrated into the central Mongolian plains. This would have led, to the formation of the Slabgrave culture, and this Scythian cultural group in the west, and the Slabgrave culture from the east, entirely replaced this, I guess, Hara Yeniseian population that could have existed in Mongolia between 2000 BC and 1000 BC or 700 BC. After 700 BC, this population doesn't really exist anymore. They've
Yeah.
been
Yeah.
replaced, assimilated into other groups, etc. Right? Now, this is important because from the Slabgrave period to the Xiongnu period, there really seems to have been one, if not several, population movements that would have replaced not per se these sort of Yeniseian like people, but the people that replaced them. So there's several populations would have been dwelling on those lands ever since those groups that could have been distantly related to the Yeniseian speaking people, right? And from a linguistic point of view, which, what I mean, it just kind of shows there's no, for anybody that would like to make the argument that since we have these Bronze Age Paleo-Siberian people that are likely a source for Yeniseian languages, as a recent DNA article had argued by Zheng and a few other people. this cannot be the source of Yeniseian languages because like Yeniseian languages are not that old in a sense that they only started diverging maybe around 2000 years ago, right? And obviously, like I said, the relationship between this group is more around 2000 BC, right?
Yeah.
So, the only genetic possibility or the only genetic population that could have been like from a, I would say from a genetic point of view, likely to have been some Yeniseian speaking people, went extinct centuries before, yeah, before the Xiongnu even existed, right? So yeah, leading to the actual Xiongnu period, there's no remnant of this, right? There is no sign of this. So I think an argument, basically from a genetic point of view, there are no Yeniseian-like people within the Xiongnu Empire, right? And that is talking about the Xiongnu Empire as a whole. Now, if you want to talk about the elites, which perhaps is, more interesting for you and is, and also for the argument that the authors make, right? The samples of the Xiongnu elites are really interesting because they have quite a lot of Chinese ancestry, but we only have a few of these, right? And this Chinese ancestry is obviously a reflection of the He policy, but I think it's very hard to say if these individuals have like a recent Chinese mother or if the Xiongnu elites had just formed a genetic profile through several generations of mixing with Chinese people that essentially became half Han, half Chinese, right? And the Xiongnu elites, right, their non-Han ancestry is pretty much just exactly this Northeastern Asian population with a little bit of Western ancestry. There's nothing that indicates a Yeniseian genetic origin, the paternal lineage. It could be connected to Yeniseian people. QL330 subclades of this haplogroup are
Yeah.
associated with Yeniseian people, but also carried by Scythians and also Turks and the Iron Age and Middle Ages, etc. Right? It's not there, right? We have R1AZ93. We Some minor lead samples have, CF1756. We There's an upcoming sample with haplogroup NM2019. CF1756 and NM2019 are very old, probably the most original Turkic paternal haplogroups. R1AZ93 would have come from Indo-Iranian people. However, by the time of this sample, they've clearly been assimilated into this Northeastern population, Northeast Asian population for many centuries, right? So the Xiongnu elites and the Xiongnu commoners, from a genetic point of view, have no indication of having any recent genetic ties to what is essentially the Yeniseian homeland. So therefore, from I do not see any genetic evidence to make the argument that um, there was a significant Yeniseian element in the Xiongnu Empire amongst its common people or its elite. In fact, I have seen not one sample where I would say it is a reasonable suggestion to suspect that this was a Yeniseian speaking individual. I've not
Yeah.
seen one. And we have, I think, probably, we have several dozens of samples from the Xiongnu Empire, perhaps maybe over 100, which is not perhaps the largest sample set, but I think it's, enough to make some ethnic assumptions, right? Transferring that to the European Huns. Now, the European Huns, when they arrive, it's quite interesting because they're often depicted or described as these like, incredibly diverse people that, we can never trace their origins because so many different people would have been considered Huns. This is like, and it's really interesting when historians suggest this because the ancient sources actually do not say this, right? The ancient sources say, well, you have the Huns, they show up, they beat the Alans, they beat the Goths, and then they basically, they rampage their way into the Pannonian Basin, and then are at the other side of the Roman Empire, right? And the people in the Hunnic like territory, right, are either Huns, Goths, Alans, or various of these sort of other sedentary people, whether they're like Balto-Slavic related people or Dacians or etc. Right? And
Hmm.
the genetic evidence is in full support of this because what we see is this Eastern population, right? That is very, very similar to the Xiongnu population, the genetic core of the Xiongnu, right? And you'll see some Goths, you'll see some Alans, you'll see some other European type people, and you'll see many mixed offspring of, various unions going all sorts of way, right? So we have samples that are let's say, like half Germanic, half Hunnic with the Germanic paternal lineage. We have the other way around where it's a Hunnic paternal lineage, but then a lot of their ancestors European. And yeah, right. It really fits what the ancient people actually said about the Huns, right? Clearly, when Marcellinus describes the Huns, he is describing a physically Asiatic population, right? Which is
Definitely.
corroborated
Mhm.
by, genetics very clearly. And I feel just like, genetics confirms the history of the European Huns. It does the same for the Xiongnu, right? Because I find that the Chinese are actually some of the best ancient historians. They would actually meticulously research various of these people that they describe, and I feel that in the West they often don't really respect enough how accurate and how detailed some of these Chinese historical texts were, because often they get a bit fantastical, and sometimes there's repetition, people using older sources, etc. But it's it is quite amazing how accurate it is actually. And what did the Chinese say about the Xiongnu, right? Or rather, what do they say about the medieval Turks? Is that they all descend from the Xiongnu, right? Whether it is the Chele, the Gok Turks, the Kyrgyz, etc. It's always said that they descend from the Xiongnu, right? All their texts showcase this. Yeah, right. I don't think it is
Yeah.
without reason. They, they make that point often, right? And that is um, what I think is also corroborated genetically, because medieval Turkic people, both in the East and in the West, um, are derived from this Xiongnu population in the same sense that the Huns were, right? Because a lot of these articles, they talk about the genetic connection between the Huns and the Xiongnu. But what they forget to mention is that, like I said earlier, right, the European Huns are basically just descendants of the Xiongnu, right? So are the Bulgars, so are the Khazars, the various other, sort of types of early medieval Turkic people that we have in Europe, right? The Oguric Turkic people. Not only are they descendants of what are essentially, the Xiongnu, right? They descend from the same little groups that the European Huns descend from, right? Like,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
a sample of the European Hun and a sample of some other Oguric speaking Turk from 2 centuries later are the same autosomal ancestry, the same paternal lineages, very similar material culture, burial customs, and they're like two drops of water, right? There's no difference between a Bulgar and a Hun, except that they just lived in different centuries. But
Hmm.
from a genetic biological point of view, they're basically the same people. And we know that the Bulgars spoke Turkic, right? Because the Bulgars, we do
Tell it to
actually
the
have their.
Bulgarians. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, it's there's probably,
I had my experience, you
Bogatur.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm well aware. But yeah, no, Bogatur is a very Bogatur is a very Slavic name, obviously. It's been attested, right?
Of
In the
course, yeah.
Hungarian text. And yeah, but obviously, you know what I mean? It's very clear that, the ancient Bulgars were a Turkey people. And this is the scientific consensus. You go on Wikipedia right now, you type in Bulgars, first thing it will say is that they're Turkic-speaking people, right?
Yeah.
And to make the argument, right, to finish it up, to say that genetic evidence supports that the Huns are Yeniseian speaking people, right, is ludicrous, because the same genetic connections that the European Huns have to the Xiongnu, right, are also shared with various other medieval modern Turkic people. And if a Bulgar and a Hun are basically cousins, right? In this, or perhaps even closer to cousins, right? To then say that both of them speak just entirely genetically unrelated languages, right? Despite being two drops of water, makes no sense. Like it really does.
There's, to round this off and also come to a conclusion to conclude this episode, and because also we're running out of meeting time once again. But it's a really good point that we arrived because we've now covered, well, basically all of the Eurasian steppe belt geographically and mentioned and discussed a lot of, steppe culture, steppe peoples that lived in between it were prominent and existed with their identities basically in between the Xiongnu era and, maybe the High Middle Ages around up until 1000 AD. And I think what is important to keep in mind that, this political component is that, as you just said, yeah, some of these people were very similar regarding their phenotype, their looks, their, secular traditions, perhaps even their religious affiliations, but they also shared a lot of common, I would say, political values in the sense of they had very similar systems. But there's this one line that stuck with me, when skimming through the ancient Chinese sources, and that is that I think it was in the Book of Tang. They, had a few sections, of course, about the Göktürks, and they referred to the ruler, the Kagan of the Göktürks, as a Chanyu. And now we both know, all of us know, that Chanyu was the title given, or giving to the Xiongnu ruler, to Bagator
Yeah.
and all of his
And his
successors.
father
Exactly,
and his
yeah, to
predecessors.
exactly. And the interesting thing here is, it is speculated that the Kagan or Kehan, as a Chinese transcribed the title, that this title might have originated or that it became really prominent either among the Xianbei and then later, of course, during the Wuran Khaganate. So the rulers of the Wuran were always called Kagan. Then the Göktürks arrive, and we know from the Göktürks themselves that they used the same title. They were the political successors. They didn't really change the system that much. But the Chinese writing about the Göktürks referred to their Khagans as Chanyu. And I think you mentioned in the beginning also that the Chinese always, not just in the case of the Göktürks, made this connection, remarked that, hey, look, this is a new people, a new state, new empire, new dynasty. Oh, and by the way, they are also from the Xiongnu, which
Yeah.
they didn't say about the Wuran or other, obviously more Mongolic people, because, the connection might have not been that big, that deep. And this is
Yeah.
also, not an argument specifically regarding this article, but when it comes to the general idea of at least the Turkic elements being very, very prominent among all of these people we discussed, basically everything west from from Lake Baikal. This is also something that was skipped over basically by the writers. And, linguistics, archaeology, DNA studies are extremely important. But I think it's also important not to lose sight of the clues given to us regarding political topics. Now, of course, this can also go into a completely wrong direction when, for example, a certain Byzantine emperor wrote about the Magyars arriving in Europe and he just called them Turks because he thought, well, they behave like Turks, they are steppe nomads, they have great horse archers, they come from the steppe. So basically, like, any other Turkic peoples. Now we know that the Magyars were not Turkic. They didn't and still don't speak a Turkic language. So, yeah, I mean, we have, to be precise, obviously, but this is just a component, not because I'm making the Turkic case now, but this is just a component that I think should not be left out, when you try to create this grand theory, trying to connect everything together. This is what these two fellow researchers tried. And yeah, I guess it's time for a final quick conclusion. So, just in case it wasn't clear enough, do you agree with this article or do you not agree? And on a scale of 0 to 100, how little do you actually agree with the article?
I mean, I would say like a 2 out of 10 in a sense that, you know what I mean? I agree with some of the science that they use, right? Like I guess I support, I support the genetic, articles that they quote, right? I'm a supporter of linguistics as a science, like I think
Yeah.
it it has like scientific merit. Um, so I guess that's why they get like 2 points, right? But as far as the actual application of it, the actual evidence, the conclusions that they came up with, yeah, I very strongly disagree with them, and I find that most of their arguments are made from a point of view that already accepted the Yeniseian origin as being the truth, right? Rather
Yeah.
than it being the end conclusion of a thorough, research.
Okay, so this has been a very interesting and very intense discussion. And we've talked a lot about a lot of topics. We've touched a lot of topics regarding steppe history, not just about the things, the subjects that I usually talk about on this channel, like Göktürks, Uyghurs, and Kyrgyz. We went back far, a few thousand years into the past, actually. And in general, any closing remarks from you?
One attempt at a summary, right? So to summarize, if you really splice all the archaeology and genetics and all that together, right? The Xiongnu Empire was started by Northeast Asian nomads that then conquered various other Northeast Asian nomads and also more Western nomads. This is the Xiongnu Empire. This formed a population that then disseminated all over the Eurasian steppes, right? Reaching all the way into Central Eastern Europe, right? Bringing not only the Huns, but also the Bulgars, the Khazars, well, honestly, every Turkic population you can think of in history, right? The Gok Turks, the Kyrgyz, the Chela, the Kypchoks, etc. They all
Yeah.
descend from this, um, yeah, Xiongnu, population. Now, my argument, and I think this is also what the argument should be as far as the scientific consensus goes, is that um, if all these other later people coming from the Xiongnu core, right, are Turkic, then this one little group, right, well, obviously not little in the sense that they had a massive historical impact, right, but there's one group called the Huns in Europe then also should be part of that, Turkic bubble. And I think this is the logical conclusion you should have going by way of real tangible evidence, which is archaeology and genetics, right? These are the bones that you can actually touch, the graves you can actually inspect
Hmm.
and visit. And I think none of that points towards Yeniseian affinity of the Xiongnu or the European Huns. And I think everything points to a Turkic affiliation, right?
Yeah.
And this is also fully in accordance with Chinese history. So, I really think that the history and genetics and archaeology, they fit perfectly. And I really hope that your fans do not take the conclusion that this means that linguistics is the one odd duck, right? Because there's actually quite a lot of linguists that have also made the case that Turkic is basically the descendant of the main Xiongnu language, or the language of the main sort of Xiongnu people, right? Um, Using the same science that these authors used, many other researchers have come to that conclusion, right? And I would say then if you take these two conclusions, right, one of them is very much in line with archaeology and genetics and logic and history, and the other one in my opinion, really isn't with these fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then that should be, you know what I mean? Like the theory that most people should go with. And yeah, this article caused up quite a storm. There's a lot of discussion about this, but um, I think in a way this is perhaps the last the last charge, if you will, right? Of the Yeniseian theory. I'll be quite confident that as time progresses, the notion that the Xiongnu and that the European Huns were, well, majority Turkic, mainly Turkic, and led and ran by Turkic people will become the consensus because truth always prevails in the end. And yeah, that is the truth, right? And I think that is that's all I have to say about this. Yeah, if your fans want to learn more about this stuff, I haven't wrote anything significantly about the Xiongnu or the Huns or the Turks in any recent time. Perhaps I will in the future again. But I have some previous, articles that that discuss this, and I'd invite them all to have a look at Museum Scythia and then learn something new, learn something exciting. And yeah, I hope they enjoyed it. Right. I want to thank you all for yeah, I don't know, the sitting by and listening to me rambling. Right. And yeah, it was awesome. It was a pleasure. And I really hope that the authors of the article come across this podcast, if they listen to it. And yeah, who knows, man? Maybe they want to come on a cons podcast. We can, set up a little debate or something. It would be cool. It would be fun. But yeah, we'll see.
I certainly
Who
wouldn't
knows?
mind, to be frank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be fun.
Awesome to have you on the show, CopperAxe. I'm gonna link your Substack page and some other stuff in the comment section below. And this was the very first time, and I'm sure not the last time. So in that sense, again, thanks for being with us, giving us insight into these topics, which is certainly interesting, not just for my fans, I guess, but also for myself. And see you next time.
Yeah, until next time.